History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5 The Making of the European Age. Chapter 2 Authority and its Challengers. Once away from the legal principle, the strengthening of the state showed itself in the growing ability of monarchs to get their way. One indicator was the nearly universal decline in the 16th and 17th centuries of the representative institutions which had appeared in many countries in the later Middle Ages. By 1789, most of Western, if not Central or Eastern, Europe was ruled by monarchs, little hindered by representative bodies. The main exception was in Great Britain. Kings began in the 16th century to enjoy powers which would have seemed remarkable to medieval barons and burghers. The phenomena is sometimes described as the rise of absolute monarchy. If we do not exaggerate a monarch's chances of actually getting his wishes carried out, for many practical checks on his power might exist which were just as restricting as medieval immunities or representative assembly. The term is acceptable. Everywhere, or almost everywhere, the relative strength of rulers vis a vis their rivals increased greatly from the 16th century onwards. New financial resources gave them standing armies and artillery to use against great nobles who could not afford them. Sometimes the monarchy was able to ally itself with the slow growth of sense of nationhood in imposing order on the over mighty. In many countries, the late 15th century had brought a new readiness to accept royal government if it would guarantee order and peace. There were special reasons in almost every case, but nearly everywhere, monarchs raised themselves further above the level of the greatest nobles and buttressed their new pretensions to respect and authority with canons and taxation. The obligatory sharing of power with great subjects, whose status entitled them de facto and sometimes de jure to office, ceased to weigh so heavily upon kings. England's Privy Council under the Tudors was at times a meritocracy almost as much as a gathering of magnates. In the 16th century and early 17th century, this brought about the appearance of what some have called the Renaissance state. This is a rather grandiose term for swollen bureaucracies staffed by royal employees and directed by aspirations to centralization. But clear enough if we remember the implied antithesis. The medieval kingdom, whose governmental functions were often in large measures delegated to feudal and personal dependents or to corporations, of which the church was the greatest. Of course, neither model of political organization existed historically in a pure form. There had always been royal officials, new men of obscure origin, and governments today still delegate tasks to non governmental bodies. There was no sudden transition to the modern state. It took centuries and often used old forms. In England, the Tudors seized on the existing institution of royal justices of the peace to weld the local gentry into the structure of royal government. This was yet another stage in a long process of undermining seigneurial authority, which elsewhere had still for centuries of life before it. Even in England, though noblemen had longed to be treated with care if they were not to be fatally antagonized. Rebellion was not an exceptional but a continuing fact of life for the 16th century statesmen. Royal troops might prevail in the end, but no monarch wanted to be reduced to reliance on force. As a famous motto had it, artillery was the last argument of kings. The history of the French nobility's turbulence, right down to the middle of the 17th century, of antagonized local interests in England, during the same period, or of Habsburg attempts to unify their territories at the expense of local magnates all show this. The United Kingdom had its last feudal rebellion in 1745. Other countries still had theirs to come. Taxation, too, because of the danger of rebellion and the inadequacy of administrative machinery to collect it, could not be pressed very far. Yet, officials and armies had to be paid for. One way was to allow officials to charge fees or levy perquisites on those who needed their services. For obvious reasons, there was not a complete answer. The raising of greater sums by the ruler was therefore necessary. Something might still be done by exploiting royal domains, but all monarchs, sooner or later, were driven back to seek new taxation, and it was a problem few could solve. There were technical problems here which could not be dealt with until the 19th century or even later. But for 3 centuries, great fertility of imagination was to be shown in inventing new taxes. Broadly speaking, only consumption through indirect taxes such as customs and excise or taxes on sale, or through requiring licenses and authorizations to trade, which had to be paid for, or real property could be tapped by the tax gatherer. Usually, this bore disproportionately upon the poorest, who spent a larger part of their small disposable income on necessities than the wealthy. Nor is it ever easy to stop a landowner from passing his tax burdens along to the man at the bottom of the property pyramid. Taxation, too, was particularly hindered by the surviving medieval idea of legal immunity. In 1500, it was generally accepted that there were areas, persons, and spheres of action which were specially protected from invasion by the power of the rule. They might be defended by an irrevocable royal grant in past ages, such as were the privileges of many cities, by contractual agreements such as the English Magna Carta was said to be, by immemorial custom, or by divine law. The supreme example was the church. Its properties were not normally subject to lay taxations. It had jurisdiction in its courts of matters inaccessible to royal justice, and it controlled important social and economic institutions. Marriage, for example. But a province or a profession or a family might also enjoy immunities, usually from royal jurisdiction or taxation. Nor was royal standing uniform. Even the French king was only a duke in Brittany, and that made a difference to what he was entitled to do there. Such facts were the realities which the Renaissance state had to live with. It could do no other than accept their survival, even if the future lay with the royal bureaucrats and their files. In the early 16th century, a great crisis shook Western Christianity. It destroyed forever the old medieval unity of the faith and accelerated the consolidation of royal power. What is, over simply, called the Protestant Reformation began as one more dispute over religious authority, the calling in question of the papal claims, whose formal and theoretical structure had successfully survived so many challenges. To that extent, it was a thoroughly medieval phenomena. But that was not to be the whole story, and far from exhausts the political significance of the Reformation. Given that it also denoted a cultural revolution, there is no reason to question its traditional standing as the start of modern history. There was nothing new about demands for ecclesiastical reform. The sense that papacy and curia did not necessarily serve the interests of all Christians was well grounded by 1500. Some critics had already gone on from this to doctrinal dissent. The deep, uneasy devotional swell of the 15th century had expressed a search for new answers to spiritual questions, but also a willingness to look for them outside the limits laid down by ecclesiastical authority. Heresy had never been blotted out, it had only been contained. Popular anti clericalism was an old and widespread phenomenon. It had long prompted demands for a more evangelical clergy. There had also appeared in the 15th century another current in religious life, perhaps more profoundly subversive than heresy, because unlike heresy, it contained forces which might in the end cut at the roots of the traditional religious outlook itself. This was the learned, humanistic, rational, skeptical, intellectual movement, which, for want of a better word, we may call Erasmian, after the man who embodied its ideals most clearly in the eyes of the contemporaries, and who was the first Dutchman to play a leading role in European history. He was profoundly loyal to his faith. He knew himself to be a Christian, and that meant unquestionably that he remained within the church. But of that church, he had an ideal which embodied a vision of a possible reformation. He sought a simpler devotion and a purer pastorate, though he did not challenge the authority of the church or papacy. In a subtler way, he challenged authority in principle, for his scholarly work had implications which were deeply subversive. So was the tone of the correspondence which he conducted with colleagues the length and breadth of Europe. They learned from him to disentangle their logic and therefore the teaching of the faith from the scholastic mummifications of Aristotelian philosophy. In his Greek New Testament, he made available a firm basis for argument on doctrine at a time when a knowledge of Greek was again becoming widespread. Erasmus, too, was the exposer of the spuriousness of texts on which bizarre dogmatic structures had been raised. Yet, neither he nor those who shared his viewpoint attacked religious authority outright, nor did they turn ecclesiastical into universal issues. They were good Catholics. Humanism, like heresy, discontent with clerical behavior and the cupidity of princes, was something in the air at the beginning of the 16th century, waiting, as many things had long waited, for the man and the occasion which would make them into a religious revolution. No other term is adequate to describe what followed the unwitting act of a German monk. His name was Martin Luther, and in 1517 he unleashed energies which were to fragment a Christian unity intact in the West since the disappearance of the Arians. Unlike Erasmus, the international man, Luther lived all his life except for brief absences in a small German town on the Elbe, Wittenberg, almost at the back of beyond. He was an Augustinian monk, deeply read in theology, somewhat tormented in spirit, who had already come to the conclusion that he must preach the scriptures in a new light, to present God as a forgiving God, not a punitive one. This need not have made him a revolutionary. The orthodoxy of his views was never in question until he quarreled with the papacy. He had been to Rome and he had not liked what he saw there, for the papal city seemed a worldly place and its ecclesiastical rulers no better than they should be. This did not dispose him to feel warmly towards the itinerant Dominican roaming Saxony as a peddler of indulgences. Papal certificates whose possessor, in consideration of payment, which went towards the building of the new and magnificent St. Peter's, then rising in Rome, was assured that some of the penalties incurred by him for sin would be remitted in the next world. Accounts of preaching of this man was brought to Luther by peasants who had heard him and bought their indulgences. Research has made it clear that what had been said to them was not only misleading but outrageous. The crudity of the transaction promoted by the preacher displays one of the most unattractive faces of medieval Catholicism. It infuriated Luther, almost obsessed as he was by the overwhelming seriousness of the transformation necessary in a man's life before he could be sure of redemption. He formulated his protests against this and certain other papal practices in a set of 95 theses setting out his positive views. In the tradition of the scholarly disputation, he posted them in Latin on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg on 21st October 1517. He had also sent the thesis to Archbishop of Mainz, Primate of Germany, who passed them to Rome with a request that Luther be forbidden by his order to preach on this theme. By this time, the thesis had been put into German and the new information technology had transformed the situation. They were printed and circulated everywhere in Germany. So Luther got the debate sought. Only the protection of Frederick of Saxony, the ruler of Luther's state, who refused to surrender him, kept him out of danger of his life. The delay in scorching the chicken of heresy in the egg was fatal. Luther's monastic order abandoned him, but his university did not. Soon, the papacy found itself confronted by a German national movement of grievance against Rome, sustained and inflamed by Luther's own sudden discovery that he was a literary genius of astonishing fluency and productivity, the first to exploit the huge possibilities of the printed pamphlet and by the ambitions of local grandees. Within 2 years, Luther was being called a Hussite. The Reformation had by then become entangled in German politics. Even in the Middle Ages, would-be reformers had looked to secular rulers for help. This did not necessarily mean going outside the fold of the faith. The great Spanish churchman Jimenez had sought to bring to bear the authority of the Catholic monarchs on the problems facing the Spanish church. Rulers were not meant to protect heretics. Their duty was to uphold the true faith. Nevertheless, an appeal to lay authority could open the way to changes which went further perhaps than their authors had intended. And this, it seems, was the case with Luther. His arguments had rapidly carried him beyond the desirability and grounds of reform in practice to the questioning of first papal authority and then of doctrine. The core of his early protests had not been theological. Nevertheless, he came to reject transubstantiation, replacing it with a view of the Eucharist even more difficult to grasp, and to preach that men and women were justified, that is, set aside for salvation, not by observance of the sacraments only, but by faith. This was clearly an intensely individualistic position. It struck at the root of traditional teaching, which saw no salvation possible outside the church. In 1520, Luther was excommunicated. Before a wondering audience, he burnt the bull of excommunication in the same fire as the books of canon law. He continued to preach and write. Summoned to explain himself before the imperial diet, he refused to retract his views. Germany seemed on the verge of civil war. After leaving the diet under the safe conduct, he disappeared, kidnapped for his own safety by a sympathetic prince. In 1521, Charles V, the emperor, placed him under the imperial ban. Luther was now an outlaw. Luther's doctrines, which he extended to condemnations of confession and absolution and clerical celibacy, by now appealed to many Germans. His followers spread them by preaching and by distributing his German translation of the New Testament. Lutheranism was also a political fact. The German princes, who entangled it in their own complicated relations with the emperor and his vague authority over them, ensured this. Wars ensued and the word Protestant came into use. By 1555, Germany was irreparably divided into Catholic and Protestant states. This was recognized in agreement at the Diet of Augsburg that the prevailing religion of each state should be that of its ruler. The first European institutionalization of religious pluralism. It was a curious concession for an emperor who saw himself as the defender of universal Catholicism. Yet it was necessary if he was to keep the loyalty of Germany's princes. In Catholic and Protestant Germany alike, religion now looked as never before to political authority to uphold it in a world of competing creeds. But there was no simple Reformation phenomenon. Other varieties of Protestantism had by then emerged from the evangelical ferment. Some drew on social unrest. Luther soon had to extinguish his own teaching from the views of peasants who invoked his name to justify rebellion against their masters. One radical group were the Anabaptists, persecuted by Catholic and Protestant rulers alike. At Munster, in 1534, their leaders' introduction of communism of property and polygamy confirmed their opponents' fears and brought a ferocious suppression upon them. But of other forms of Protestantism, only Calvinism can be noticed in so general an account as this. It was to be Switzerland's most important contribution to the Reformation, though created by a Frenchman, John Calvin. He was a theologian who formulated his essential doctrines while still a young man. The absolute depravity of man after the fall of Adam and the impossibility of salvation except for those few, the elect, predestined by God to salvation. If Luther, the Augustinian monk, spoke with the voice of Paul, Calvin evoked the tones of Augustine. It is not easy to understand the success of this gloomy creed, but to its efficacy, the history not only of Geneva, but of France, England, Scotland, the Dutch Netherlands, and British North America all witness. The crucial step was conviction of membership of the elect. As the signs of this were outward adherence to the commandments of God and participation in the sacraments, it was less difficult to achieve such conviction than might be imagined. Under Calvin, Geneva was not a place for the easygoing. He had drawn up the constitution of a theocratic state which provided the framework for a remarkable exercise in self government. Blasphemy and witchcraft were punished by death, but this would not have struck contemporaries as surprising. Adultery, too, was a crime in most European countries and one punished by ecclesiastical courts. But Calvin's Geneva took this offense much more seriously and imposed the death penalty for it. Adulterous women were drowned, men beheaded, an apparent reversal of the normal penal practice of a male dominated European society, where women, considered weaker vessels morally and intellectually, were usually indulged with milder punishments than men. Severe punishments, too, were reserved for those guilty of heresy. From Geneva, where its pastors were trained, the new sect took root in France, where it won converts among the nobility and had more than 2,000 congregations by 1561. In the Netherlands, England and Scotland, and in the end, Germany. It challenged Lutheranism. It spread also to Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary. Calvinism's early vigor surpassed that of Lutheranism, which, except in Scandinavia, was never strongly entrenched beyond the German lands which first adopted it. The variety of the Protestant Reformation still defies summary and simplification. Complex and deep rooted in its origins, it also owed much to circumstance and was varied, rich, and far reaching in its effects and expressions. If the name Protestantism can be taken seriously as an indicator of fundamental identity beneath the disorder of its many expressions, that identity is to be found in its influence and effect. It was disruptive. In Europe and the Americas, it created new ecclesiastical cultures founded on the study of the Bible and preaching, to which it gave an importance sometimes surpassing that of the sacraments. It was to shape the lives of millions by accustoming them to a new and an intense scrutiny of private conduct and conscience, and it recreated the non celibate clergy. Negatively, it slighted or at least called in question all existing ecclesiastical institutions and created new political forces in the form of churches, which princes could now manipulate for their own ends, often against popes whom they saw simply as princes like themselves. Rightly, Protestantism was to come to be seen by friend and foe alike as one of the forces determining the shape of modern Europe and therefore of the world. Yet neither Lutheranism nor Calvinism provoked the first rejection of papal authority by a nation state. In England, a unique religious change arose almost by accident. A new dynasty originating in Wales, the Tudors, had established itself in the end of the 15th century, and the second king of this line, Henry VIII, became entangled with the papacy over his wish to dissolve the first of his six marriages in order to remarry and get an heir, an understandable preoccupation. This led to a quarrel and one of the most remarkable assertions of lay authority in the whole 16th century. It was one fraught with significance for England's future. With the support of his parliament, which obediently passed the required legislation, Henry VIII proclaimed himself head of church in England. Doctrinally, he conceived no break with the past. He was, after all, entitled defender of the faith by the Pope because of a refutation of Luther from the royal pen. His descendant still bears that title. But the assertion of the royal supremacy opened the way to an English church separate from Rome. A vested interest in it was soon provided by a dissolution of monasteries and some other ecclesiastical foundations and the sale of property to buyers among the aristocracy and gentry. Churchmen, sympathetic to new doctrines, sought to move the church in England significantly towards continental Protestant ideas in the next reign. Popular reactions were mixed. Some saw this as the satisfaction of old national traditions of descent from Rome. Some resented innovations. From a confused debate and murky politics emerged a literary masterpiece, the Book of Common Prayer, and some martyrs, both Catholic and Protestant. There was a reversion to papal authority and the burning of Protestant heretics under the fourth Tudor, the unfairly named and unhappy Bloody Mary, perhaps England's most tragic queen. But this time, moreover, the question of religion was thoroughly entangled with national interest and foreign policy, for the states of Europe drew apart more and more on religious grounds. This was not all that was notable about the English Reformation, which, like the German, was a landmark in the evolution of national consciousness. It had been carried out by an act of parliament, and a constitutional question was implicit in the religious settlement. Were there any limits to legislative authority? With the accession of Mary's half sister, Elizabeth I, the pendulum swung back, though for a long time it was unclear how far. Yet Elizabeth insisted, and her parliament legislated, that she retain the essentials of her father's position. The English Church, or the Church of England, as it may henceforth be called, claimed to be Catholic in doctrine but rested on the royal supremacy. More important still, because that supremacy was recognized by Act of Parliament, England would be at war with the Catholic King of Spain, who was well known for his determination to root out heresy in the lands he subjugated. So, another national cause was identified with that of Protestantism.